Eric.
Is this artificial value? Is that what this is?
I'm not sure what the economists call it. But I mean, yeah, I would guess that seems like a reasonable way to describe it.
Okay.
Zach, and then
If you're interested in bubbles bursting and that kind of speculation, watch The Big Short. Really good movie about the 2008 financial crisis, with the housing market burst, and they go over, and the people in that movie make a lot of money off of it.
yep. Yeah,
So, just to so is that what happens with every bubble? That like every time a bubble bursts, like somebody who has a lot of like whatever is getting popular, like panics for some reason and then like floods the market with all their stuff, and then that makes everybody else panic? Like, is that what always happens, or are there like a lot of different forms it takes?
It's not usually like somebody dumps all of their stuff all at once. It's more that the people who are really closely watching the market are watching how many shares are for sale on any given day. And if they start seeing the number of shares for sale creep up, they're like, wait, people are selling. Why are people selling? You know, and if that number starts creeping up, then they start selling, and then, you know, and it starts to turn into a cascade. So it's usually not one person sort of dumping. Although I just saw, does not bode well for us, but I just saw last week that the gold market, which is, there's several $1 trillion worth of gold in circulation worldwide. The gold market, the price of gold jumped, I don't know, 4% or something in one day, which meant that somebody put in an order for several 100 million pounds of gold. Somebody with a whole lot of money was jumping out of other forms of investment and going to gold, and gold is the usual harbor for if you think everything's going to go to hell and crash, put your money in gold because it keeps its value.
Warren Buffett just retired and said Trump's going to ruin the economy.
Yeah, so maybe it was Buffett moving all his money into gold, who knows, but why?
I'm actually in that because I was handed like a decent amount of money for college, and I decided I'm putting it in gold. So now I'm like every day I'm watching it, and I've made a decent amount, but I'm just waiting for like something to happen. So yeah, it's interesting.
I don't want to talk
Keep your
about this
money there.
anymore.
How far did this depression reach up beyond like the lower middle classes into the higher ones?
It hit a lot of people. I mean, there were actually, it's an exaggeration, but there were stories of bodies hitting Wall Street. People jumping out of windows when they saw the stock ticker and realized they'd lost all their money. Or, I mean, the worst part is that people who are buying stocks on margin, right? They're taking out $1 million loan and they're buying stock with it, and then the stock price crashes, and that stock is now worth $100,000. So they owe $900,000 to the bank, and they have $100,000 in the assets. You can just default, make it the bank's problem. They can have the stock, you walk away, but that ruins your credit rating, et cetera. But if there are other guarantees, or you've taken on loans in other ways, you're on the hook for that $900,000 a year. You know.
So even if you bury like $5 million, it's still not gonna save you?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, you know, there's an interesting, this is not exactly answering your question, but the standard thing on the stock market is they tell you if the market starts crashing, don't sell, just sit there, it'll go back up. Some economists figure out if you had a bunch of stock in 1929 and you just didn't sell it, you just held on to it, when would you be back to where you were in 1929? The answer was like 1953. Oh! It was like 25 years later.
So sometimes it is the right move to sell.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're telling you don't sell because they want to be the ones selling.
Yeah, that's
I don't
true.
want to talk about this anymore.
So the New York Stock Exchange was one stock exchange. There's the Nikkei is in Tokyo, and there's the Frankfurt, and there's London, and the FTSE and all the rest. So the New York Stock Exchange was one stock exchange, and it had been going up consistently, and people had been investing on margin, it's called, where you borrow the money and buy the stock, and then et cetera. In late October of 1929, it all fell apart. Now, you'll traditionally hear about October 29th, Black Tuesday, which was the biggest single day loss, but it was a week of bad losses, right? It was a week of people suddenly realizing that the stock market is plummeting, everybody's trying to sell, and that made everybody else try to sell, and that made the prices go on more, etc. Over the course of the week, the New York Stock Exchange lost something like 90% of its value, meaning that if you added up the value of all the stocks we're trading at before the crash, and then added up all the value of those same stocks after the crash, they're only worth 10% as much as they were before. Which, in practical terms, means if you had $10 million in stock on Friday, you had $1 million in stock by Friday, right? And so lots of people were really ruined. And this had a ripple effect through the economy for a number of reasons. There's two vicious cycles that get set off by this stock market crash. The first is a banking cycle. Banks had been loaning out all this money to people to buy stock, and the stock was the collateral. And when the stock market crashes, people realize that they owe $1 million to the bank and they have $100,000 in the stock, and they're like, I'm going to let the bank repossess the stock. But the bank has now lost $900,000, right? Because they loaned $1 million of good money, and they now have stock worth $100,000. And in fact, the bank is going to try to sell that, and the stock market is still crashing. So what are they going to get for it? Right? This causes the banks to suddenly be short on capital and shaky, meaning that lots of people get worried they're going to crash. Now, with a bank at this time, there was no deposit insurance. And so if you deposited money in a bank and the bank went out of business, you just lost your money. Okay? So as soon as people heard about a bank was in trouble because they had a whole bunch of bad loans from the Wall Street crash, they would go and try to take their money out before the bank went bad. And this is another version of the stock market bubble bursting, because if everybody tries to take the money out of the bank at the same time, the bank can't let them all have their money. Every bank, typically, they take in your savings and then they send out 90% of that, loan it to other people for mortgages or car loans or business loans or whatever. So 90% of your money is somewhere else. They're making money off of it. They only keep about 10% around because they figure on any given day, it's no more than 10% of our customers are going to want their money out. But if everybody runs on the bank and demands their money on the same day, the bank has no choice but to close its doors and just declare bankruptcy, which means everybody loses their money. This is called a run on a bank. So, but the other problem is that these banks lost so much money that they don't have any money to loan anymore, right? Suppose a bank had $50 million in loans out, and most of them were in the stock market, and now they suddenly have $5 million. You know, they get they repossess all that stock, but now they have $5 million. Well, that's not enough to loan out a lot of money anymore. They don't have $50 million to loan out anymore. They have $5 million. And if that happens to every bank, then suddenly it's very hard to borrow money, right? Because the banks don't have it. And if banks don't have that money, this in particular starts to hit corporations, because big corporations borrow money to build a new factory or to buy materials, etc. And then they take out short-term loans, so they're going to buy a whole bunch of steel, and then they're going to make a bunch of cars, and they'll sell the cars and pay back the loan to the bank that they borrowed to buy the steel. Or some companies even, and it varies from company to company, industry to industry, but some companies find that their payroll, the nature of the business is that they don't have any sales for a long time, and then they sell something huge, like say you're a shipbuilder, right? It takes you 6 months to build a ship, but when you sell it, suddenly you've got millions and millions of dollars, but then it's 6 months before you get paid again. But you've got to pay your workers every week. And so what you would do is you'd set up a line of credit with a bank so that you can borrow money to pay your workers until you sell that one ship, and then you can pay off the bank, et cetera. Well, suddenly corporations find that the banks don't have the money for that, right? Credit gets tighter, which means interest rates go up, so corporations find it's more expensive to borrow money to pay payroll, or they can't even find a bank that will loan them money to pay payroll. And so what the corporations do, that's the first vicious cycle, is that the banking turns into a vicious cycle of the more the banks lose money, the more they lose money, and the tighter credit gets, the more money, the less the banks make money. And so it becomes a sort of vicious cycle of spiraling, and banks collapse and crash, et cetera. The second one is that these corporations now are finding it difficult to make payroll or to borrow money to buy raw materials, et cetera. And so their response is, we'd better cut back on production, we'd better lay off workers. And so they lay off a bunch of workers. But if enough corporations start laying off workers, two things happen. One, those laid off workers don't buy anything. And two, other people see that the unemployment rate is climbing up and people are getting laid off, and they think, oh, my job might not be safe either. I had better not buy that new car or buy that new refrigerator because I'm not sure I'm going to have a job next month. And so basically, once enough corporations start laying off workers, you start to see consumer buying drop precipitously. And as consumers stop buying stuff, corporations start going, oh, our sales are crashing. We'd better lay off more workers. And the more workers they lay off, the less people buy, and the more their sales crash. And so it's an economy-wide thing that the more they lay off workers, the less people are buying, and the less people are buying, the more they have to lay off workers. Right? And so this is not a fast process. This is not like it happened at the end of October 1929. It's a slow process, but it's sort of like watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. It really would take, the depth of the depression was about 1932. That's when it really, the full process of the stock market crash, setting off a cascade of failing banks and layoffs and consumer buying dropping off, et cetera. It takes 3 years or 2.5 years to really hit the deepest part of that. And 1932 is about as bad as it gets. Any questions about that? Just to give you some idea of what this meant. By 1932, 25% of British workers were unemployed. The unemployment rate in January of this year was like 4%, something like that. Economists don't think you can go below 2%. There's always going to be 2% of the population that's sort of between jobs or something. So 4% was pretty good. 25% is horrid. Germany had 40% unemployment rate, 4-0. Now I want to make something else clear about this. It varied from country to country, but generally they did not count women in the unemployment rate because the assumption was women didn't need to work. Now working class women desperately needed to work, but generally the economists only counted men in the unemployment rate. So when you're talking about a 25% unemployment rate, you're talking about 25% of the men unemployed. Or 40% unemployment means 40% of the men are unemployed. And that's not the whole story, because often what companies would do is they say, we have to reduce payroll by 50%. We could lay off half of our workers and throw them into misery because there's a bad job market. Or we could say to all of our workers, you're all going to half-time. And a lot of companies did that. So they would move all their workers to half-time, cut their payroll in half, but everybody still has some money, a job to put some food on the table, et cetera. So companies did that to be sort of humanitarian, but then none of those workers show up in the unemployment numbers because they still have jobs, but they're making half as much as they did, which means they're desperately poor compared to what they were before, but that doesn't show up in the unemployment number either. So women aren't counted, underemployment isn't counted, so the actual amount of misery that 40% in Germany is just hard to fathom how much misery and poverty we're talking about. Let's see.
So like, what is the age cutoff for like the people that qualify for the unemployment counts? Because it's like people who are like, I assume that they have to be like legal adults, because of course like
not at this time.
But then it's like, I think 14 is the youngest that someone can start working. And like that's well below 18, but at the same time, like that's like probably, I don't think a lot of 14-year-olds are working, but some of them probably are. So
yeah,
like, there's that.
I can't give you a hard answer on that because every country is different in how they calculate the numbers. And in fact, from year to year, they change how they calculate the numbers. Because some countries, once they realized how bad the numbers were, began to fiddle with the numbers by, oh, we won't count that group. We won't count 14 to 18-year-olds, so the unemployment rate drops, et cetera. So it varies from country to country, it varies from time to time. But in general, they count people from the moment they're legally able to work. But that also varies from country to country, as what's legal to work and how many hours, et cetera. And then they also, I know today, they tend to see, for instance, somebody who's a full-time student as not being unemployed if they don't have a job, because the assumption is they didn't need one anyway, or they're living at home with their parents or whatever. So they typically don't count high school students as unemployed.
Well, even like college students, I think if you are a full-time student in college, even if you have no job whatsoever, they
don't count
you as unemployed technically because
right. Yeah. So the answer is it's messy. Any other questions?
So like, I know this is like Germany a long time ago, but like, were people able to collect like unemployment money? Okay.
Yes, there was unemployment money. It was wildly insufficient.
Okay.
The governments didn't have the money for it, so it basically just ran out.
Yeah.
So they gave unemployment benefits to the first 100,000 people who showed up, and then they're like, sorry, it's all gone.
I guess like my concern is like, I guess like what I'm just like thinking of is if you're like, okay, now you're at halftime, then they wouldn't like be able to collect unemployment.
Mm-hmm.
It's I don't know, like when there was like the pandemic and like people were laid off from their jobs, but then like the people that had to stay were making the same amount of money.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yes. Let me just point out the depression in most of Europe. Germany actually pulled out of the depression fairly quickly. I mentioned this. Hitler didn't know what he was doing, but he did exactly the right thing. He began to rearm Germany in preparation for World War II, beginning when he came to power in 1933. And by 1934, the German unemployment rate had plummeted back down to like 5% or something. He had basically pulled Germany out of the depression by borrowing money and opening up armaments factories and giving young men in particular jobs that often were just disguised military basic training.
Was he doing this at the same time that like Roosevelt was doing the New Deal, like similar idea but less warmongering?
Yes, exactly. So in the United States, we did the Civilian Conservation Corps, which we had young men go and make roads in national forests and create campgrounds, etc. Hitler had the same thing. It was a Civilian Conservation Corps, and ostensibly they were making roads and stuff, but most of their time was spent with shovels over their shoulders, learning how to march in lockstep, and then learning.
Oh yes, to make roads like that.
Yeah, and so it was disguised, and because of the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler couldn't have an army that was over 100,000 soldiers, but he could have a Civilian Conservation Corps that was several million
young men building trails.
Yeah, exactly.
Helping with infrastructure.
Yeah.
Definitely not learning how to shoot a rifle and preparing for an attempted Nazi takeover of the world.
Well, basically they did all the parts of basic training that were not
holding a gun.
And then Hitler just basically, as soon as he said he was no longer abiding by the Treaty of Versailles, all of the guys in the Civilian Conservation Corps just got dumped in the army and went through the rest of basic training and were ready to go. So,
gotta give him points. He was clever about that.
On gender roles, the Depression had a significant impact. First of all, as a general rule, and this is not an absolute rule, but as a general rule, you will see a cultural movement towards greater gender equality mostly in good economic times. When people are not worried about their next paycheck and they're not worried about making ends meet, et cetera, they're willing to tolerate the idea of women in these jobs or women in those jobs, et cetera. But when they're worried about it, they tend to say, no, we've got to go back to the basics, and they tend to shove aside equality for women. And so what you see in the 1930s is a significant shift back towards more traditional gender roles, and you can see it with women's clothing. The dresses get a little longer, they get much more conservative, et cetera. It's not a complete undoing of the 1920s because the dresses didn't go back down to the ground; they went back to mid-calf. But it is a significant reduction of the flapper became unacceptable socially, and you just don't see that anymore. But one of the biggest ways the Depression hit that is that companies, because of the culture, decided that men needed jobs more than women, because the assumption was a man is supporting a family with his job, but a woman is just earning a little extra money and she's not supporting a family, which can be totally contrary to reality. But companies generally, if they had to cut payroll, would first lay off all the women and then start laying off men. And so they usually had a policy of laying off women first. And governments encouraged this because they didn't count women in the unemployment rate. So if a company laid off 6,000 workers and they were all women, it doesn't show up in the unemployment rate, right? So generals tend to throw a lot of women out of work. But ironically, as the Depression lengthened on, a lot of companies began, as men got laid off too, a lot of companies began to hire back women because they could pay them lower wages than the men. And so for companies that were struggling, it was easier to hire women because you pay them less, and then you were saving money. But overall, you see a real turn back towards idealizing the woman as homemaker, mother, and turn back away from sexual liberation, away from cabarets, away from films and suggestive songs, and etc., and toward a much more conservative sexual politics, if you will. Any questions about that? And you can see this in a lot of ways, and one of the things I want to mention is that one of the key ideas of fascism was that it was hyper-masculine. It was about violence, political violence. It celebrated war. It celebrated masculinity. And fascism, as a corollary, tended to push women out of politics, to say women shouldn't. Fascists don't want the vote anyway because they want dictators. But if there is a vote, they don't want women to have it. The Nazis in particular had their slogan for women was Kinderkirche Küche, which means kids, church, and kitchen was the only place women belonged. And the Nazis were also eugenicists, so they wanted to do everything they could to encourage Aryan women, which is the women of the race they liked, to have as many children as possible, and to discourage all other women from having children. So, for instance, in Nazi Germany, abortion was totally legal if you weren't an Aryan. But if you were an Aryan, you had to show there was genetic defects or some probability of genetic defects to get an abortion, because they wanted Aryan women to carry every pregnancy to term. But if a Jewish woman wanted an abortion, great, they were fine with that, right? But listen.
So was there actually any kind of scientific backing, scientific basis, yeah, for the races in Nazism?
No.
Or was it just completely just bullshit?
They tried. Hitler came to power in 1933. They poured government money into every research institute studying race that they could. And the Nazi regime fell in 1945, and they still had not come up with any scientific way to even determine what race somebody was. So they had nothing.
Great, very unsurprising.
The thing is, the Nazis thought that they thought Germans were Aryans, and they thought there was the Slavs were a different race. And the Slavs are like Poles, Russians, etc., Ukrainians, anybody who speaks a Slavic language. And they're both blonde-haired and blue-eyed.
And they're both largely not blonde-haired and blue-eyed. They're both.
Well, yeah,
they both run the gamut of blonde to brunette to darker, right, and blue and brown and green.
Yeah, absolutely. But the Nazis celebrated the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Nazi. But there's plenty of blonde-haired, blue-eyed Slavs. And in fact, if you go back historically, the Nazis didn't really know this. But for instance, the kingdom of Kievan Rus, which is seen as the origin of Russia and Ukraine, was founded by a bunch of Swedish Vikings. So I mean, who were Aryans according to the Nazis.
Well,
So
I'm like thinking back to like Russian fairy tales and Ukrainian fairy tales. Like the masculine heroes are like there's always one character that's like a blonde, kind of boyish, like rough and tumble, soldier. But there's always like blonde, like there's so many like blonde, strong boys.
Absolutely. Why?
I mean, that whole image is just reminding me of Wagner's Ring Cycle.
Oh,
the entire like storyline with that, and then Siegfried, and then also just the amount of incest, and it's a wonderful story, and it's just so Germanic in the fact that this is what Germany should be. This is exactly what I'm going to try and push.
Yeah. Well, Hitler was absolutely obsessed with Wagner. When he was living down and out as an unemployed or underemployed semi-construction worker, semi-vagrant in Vienna, every time he could scrape together money, he went to see a Wagner play or opera. Absolutely loved it.
Also, that's why he married his cousin.
He didn't marry her. Well, that's a whole.
He murdered her
Yeah.
when she was pregnant with his baby.
Yes, well, there's a whole lot of speculation about all of that. We do know. I mean, we do know that Hitler had a long, close relationship with his niece.
Perhaps intimate.
And there's a great deal of speculation. It's intimate. We do know that she died by a gunshot wound in Hitler's apartment with Hitler's gun. It was deemed a suicide. We don't know if she was pregnant.
She was.
Why are you so confident she was?
She was.
I also want to believe Hitler is a big fan of incest.
So anyway, yeah. Let's
I mean,
talk about the
I just
incest
kind of have to
problem.
point out that like that is one way to keep the genes in the family. Not in a good way, but
As long as you like big chins, I guess it's okay. You guys are all aware of the Habsburgs.
Yeah.
What?
The Habsburgs were the ruling family of Austria-Hungary, and they had a policy of inbreeding to keep the family line narrow and to keep the nobility, etc. And you can trace over the course of the 1400s to the 1600s the portraits of Habsburg monarchs. You can see the chins get bigger and bigger and bigger because they're inbreeding bigger and bigger chins
That's
for whatever
insane.
reason. Wyatt?
I always thought that was the Spanish Habsburgs, though. Or was it both?
It's both. They were connected, and with Charles V, they're the same because he inherits both thrones. But,
I wish we had like layered style portraiture of the Egyptian Ptolemy family line.
yeah, there you go. Would have been interesting.
I mean, according to some sources, like Cleopatra ended up being attractive enough that they probably didn't have the like Habsburg sort of visual inbreeding.
Or
She's an interesting case. I wonder how much of that is the Romans being like, she was horrible, everyone hated her, and how much of that was, she was actually very clever, but like all of this stuff, house layer,
Well,
gets painted in certain
Julius Caesar and Mark Antony
Yes.
both fell hard for her, so I don't know what that says, but
When I was younger, my grandma had like all of these like barn cats, and like she didn't have like the money or whatever to get them fixed, so they would like keep reproducing with each other, and they would come out and they'd have like so many toes.
yes,
Like just so many, and like every year like the paws would get bigger and bigger.
yeah, polydactyly. Yeah. Here's a weird little tidbit for you. Cleopatra lived closer to us than to the Great Pyramids being built. The Great Pyramids were built 2500 BCE, and she lived about 0 roughly, and so she was about 2,000 years before us, but 2,500 years after the Great Pyramids.
I just want to point out that even if both families did do a lot of inbreeding, at least the Habsburgs didn't constantly try to kill each other as much as the Ptolemies did. They might have gotten close, but at least they didn't.
All right, on that happy note, let's take a 5-minute break.